How do we decide what makes a legend in the music industry? How do we pick and choose between all of the undoubtedly talented people that have come along over the years and decide to put a crown on only a select few? What makes a legend? What defines a legacy? Who gets left behind and why? The music industry is a fickle business, one that is at times both frustrating and confusing for those who are in the industry or keep up with its news. Especially now in the days of TikTok, the industry seems to be overwhelmed with an influx of talent. It honestly makes it hard to tell if our generation has a single defining artist that seems to speak for us all. Past generations, however, did have those individual talents among them. Individuals who defined their generation not just through their music, but through their grasp of the mindset that defined that particular generation. How can we think of the 1940s without picturing Frank Sinatra serenading a crowd? How can we picture the 1960s without thinking of a Beatles concert? And how can you even begin to think of the 1980s without thinking of Thriller by Michael Jackson? But how do three artists like them compare? What was similar about them that led to them being generation-defining artists? Is one of them ultimately more important to our culture over the rest? And while acts like these three soared to fame, who got left behind? Generally, when speaking about impact in the music industry, a lot of people tend to gravitate towards how many number one hits an artist had, how many album sales they had, and tend to use that as indications of just how influential an artist was. These metrics are all right as far as general fame and success are concerned, but when it comes to understanding artists that really tapped into the mindset of a culture, we have to dig a little bit deeper than just sales. Let's take a look back at these three legends that I mentioned earlier: Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, and Michael Jackson, and we'll see how they compare, how they inspired not only the world but also each other, and how they rank as some of the most influential artists of all time. Frank Sinatra was born in 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey, to a pair of Italian immigrants. Finding inspiration from the likes of Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra quickly made a name for himself through his dynamic vocal range and his big personality. After years of performing alongside acts in the 1930s, Frank Sinatra was able to carve out a name for himself. He began recording music on his own, which was met with great acclaim. By the early 1940s, Sinatra mania had taken full effect. Teenage girls couldn't get enough of Frank Sinatra, the sensitive Italian-American boy from Hoboken, New Jersey, and they couldn't get enough of his golden voice. With so many men away fighting in World War II at the time, Frank Sinatra had the unique opportunity of being one of the few eligible bachelors that were still in the United States. Therefore, teenage girls could project their love and their desires onto this teenage heartthrob. He was young, talented, charismatic, had a golden voice, and he was right here in the United States. The girls were absolutely smitten. Sinatra himself said that he owed a lot of his early success to the fact that he did not serve in World War II. Another major reason that Sinatra was able to soar to the top during the 1940s is because of the musician strike that was going on at the time. During this time, big bands were some of the most popular form of entertainment in the United States. Think songs like Sing 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 and Benny Goodman. However, due to concerns with how musicians were receiving royalties, a lot of musicians went on strike, which meant less big band music. So it was essentially a perfect time for a crooner like Sinatra to swoop in. Although there had been teen heartthrobs before Frank Sinatra, think Rudolph Valentino in film in the early 20th century, it is with Sinatra that we really see the modern version of teenage obsession and adoration that we know of today. There are many reasons for why this happened at this exact moment in history. Part of it has to do with the fact that Frank Sinatra did not serve in World War II, and like I said earlier, he was available. Part of it was also because in this period of time, teenagers had more purchasing power. The United States was entering into better economic times, and teenagers were able to spend their money. We also have to consider the increased accessibility of radios in the 1940s and 1950s. And probably one of the most important factors is that record executives were beginning to see the purchasing power of teenagers at the time. This is pretty much the first time that we really see the marketing being shifted from adult, mature audiences over to teenagers, which is how we end up getting teenage crazes of the 1950s and 1960s. In addition to his influence over the youth culture in the 1940s, Frank Sinatra was also making important moves in the recording studio, one of which would be his focus on concept albums. Although concept albums are common today in the music industry, Frank Sinatra was really a pioneer when it came to these in the 1940s and 1950s. By releasing concept albums, Frank Sinatra gave his audience a reason to listen to an album in its entirety, which meant that people actually had to buy the album to listen to it in its entirety. Later on in his career, Frank Sinatra became a record executive of his own when he founded his own record label in 1960. This record label was called Reprise Records. Having his own record label really gave Sinatra full artistic control over his work, which was something that artists could only dream of back then. And also sort of today. Think Taylor Swift re-recording all of her albums to own her masters. Because Frank Sinatra had full creative control over his art as well as his business, this meant that he could work with the best in the business. It meant that he could pretty much carve out his own public persona. He had full control over everything in his career, which is part of the reason that we all have this mental image of Frank Sinatra being this intelligent, classy guy. So, how exactly did Frank Sinatra reach the level of American icon, becoming a legend in the music industry and beyond? The first and most obvious reason has to be Frank Sinatra's voice. Sinatra was such a one-of-a-kind talent that he was often referred to as the voice. Watching Frank Sinatra perform was a privilege, as those who were lucky enough to see him perform would tell you. In addition to being a real raw talent, Frank Sinatra also ventured into other industries, making him successful over and over and over again in many different ways. Frank Sinatra was the first singer to become a movie star, yes, even before Elvis Presley. He also started his own record label, and he had his own film production company. Even when Frank Sinatra's career became a bit stale, he was able to revitalize it in the 1960s, scoring hits at the exact same time as his daughter Nancy Sinatra, a good 2 decades into his career. Frank Sinatra owned the songs that he sang. You know that it's a Frank Sinatra song without even looking at the artist if it comes up in a random shuffle on Spotify. There are certain songs that we all think of as Sinatra songs, regardless of who else covered them or who else performed them. We know it as a Sinatra song. He was that much of a domineering figure in the music industry. Frank Sinatra is synonymous with the 1940s, and through his own success, he set a precedent for artists who came after him to follow. Through his public image, his business acumen, his devoted fan base, his eagerness to always outdo himself, Sinatra was a hard star to follow. But 4 guys from Liverpool kinda did it. If you watched our last video on the Beatles' influence over pop culture, you know just how influential the Beatles are and continue to be to this day. Although Frank Sinatra had his own version of Beatlemania in the 1940s, dubbed Sinatra Mania, people generally tend to remember Beatlemania as a term before Sinatra Mania. It had that much of an impact on the culture. Something that the Beatles had that Frank Sinatra did not was choice. There were 4 members of the band, and fans could pick their favorite, someone that they related to, someone that they felt close to. This inspired individuality amongst the fans. They could follow the individual Beatles on their individual paths and feel like they were following them on their own musical journeys. This is just one of the things that allowed the Beatles to be so influential. From 1963 to 1970, the Beatles revolutionized the world of music. Taking things further than the likes of Sinatra, who tended to be a bit formulaic when it came to creating quality music, the Beatles were always interested in pushing the boundaries of popular music. While Sinatra could pump out one quality record after another, and believe me, the man has an insane discography, he never really ventured far out of his comfort zone. I mentioned earlier how it's always easy to tell when a Frank Sinatra song is a Frank Sinatra song. You know that voice even before you check the song. And this is great when you want to remain a recognizable artist. Frank Sinatra Sinatrified every bit of music he ever produced. Even when he ended up covering the Beatles song Something, he completely Sinatrified it and made it his own thing. With the Beatles, however, part of the reason they are so influential is that the latter half of their discography is virtually unrecognizable from what they were releasing when they first came out as a band. And the best part is, it's almost all fantastic. It's not easy to take the risk of pushing boundaries and release quality music while doing it almost every time, but somehow the Beatles were able to do it. The Beatles set a precedent for all songwriters and artists who came after them. While none of the Beatles on their own possessed the raw singing talent of someone like Frank Sinatra, although My personal opinion, Paul McCartney does not get enough credit for his vocal range, but that's beside the point. What the Beatles did possess in charisma and charm and attractiveness made even their earliest shows an absolute delight to be in attendance for. Even in their early Cavern Club days, the Beatles were an experience. Their performances often felt personal to fans, and this carried over on their records as well. The Beatles were also one of the first popular acts to sort of move away from what most people thought of to be an acceptable public persona. Not one member of the Beatles was ever afraid to joke around with the press, to be honest, to say whatever they wanted, even from their earliest interviews. They stayed true to themselves, even at the height of their fame, which was something that a lot of people liked. Even people who were far removed from the throes of Beatlemania were known to appreciate their authenticity. Great public personas are all well and good, but why exactly are the Beatles still legends? And why are we still talking to them 60 plus years after the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand? The Beatles' legacy is regularly regarded as something sort of mystical, with things just happening to fall into place that led them to one thing or another throughout the course of their careers as the Beatles. There's lore and mystery to the background of the band, which is part of the reason why people still have such a strong interest in them all these decades later. There's also the fact that the Beatles were always ahead of the curve, oftentimes setting a precedent for their own contemporaries back in the 1960s. One way that this can be seen is the Beatles' interest in Eastern culture and music. The Beatles were almost directly responsible for introducing the Western world to Eastern music. And of course, George Harrison in particular continued to study Eastern religion for the rest of his life. Like Sinatra, the Beatles stretched their Beatley arms into many different parts of pop culture. They worked as songwriters for other acts such as Peter and Gordon. They were in a few movies. They had their own record label. They had their own clothing line. The Beatles set a high bar for personal improvement as well as professional improvement for other artists, both their contemporaries and musicians and artists today. And this is a high bar that few people have been able to tap. Of course, we cannot talk about icons of pop music without talking about Michael Jackson. From roughly 1972 to 2001, Michael Jackson was in the prime of his career. That's pretty much 30 years of being in the prime of your career, which is absolutely mind-blowing. Following his successful career as a child star with his siblings in the Jackson 5, Michael Jackson experienced a Jackson frenzy after going solo in the 1970s. When Michael Jackson released Thriller in 1982 at just 24 years old, it was a game changer for the music industry. The album has been certified platinum a total of 34 times since its release, making it one of the most successful albums of all time. In addition to his obvious commercial success, Michael Jackson was also hugely influential in desegregating the landscape of the music industry, becoming the first African-American entertainer to have a really solid crossover fan base. As Michael Jackson was an early pioneer of the art of music videos, he used this art to tear down racial barriers, and also to tell stories in another way that no artist had really done before. Thriller was such a successful album, in fact, that it is considered to single-handedly have saved the music industry from a recession that was going on in the 1970s, and to basically get music out of a slump. Can you imagine being single-handedly responsible for changing pretty much everything about the landscape of the music industry at just 24 years old? Well, he did it. He changed the landscape of performance and of artistry, and it's still followed by so many musicians and artists today. Jackson was prolific. He reached heights commercially and culturally that few artists have been able to do before or since. He was a combination of natural talent, savviness, and charisma, in a way that we haven't really seen from, again, more artists before or since. But when comparing these three artists that we've talked about, who takes the cake as the most influential of all time? My honest answer is, I don't really think any of them should be considered the single most influential artist of all time. Each of the three artists that we talked about today offered us as an audience something unique. Of course, they all had devoted fan bases, and all three of them were hugely commercially successful. In fact, even today with streaming, it's still difficult for some modern artists to beat the records of Sinatra, the Beatles, and Jackson. All three have had such a lasting impact on culture that it almost seems to transcend time and space. They are eternal. They are continuously modern. Michael Jackson, the Beatles, and Frank Sinatra never really left the public conscience. The fact is, though, none of these artists exist within a vacuum. While we can count all the ways that these artists continue to be influential, why they were so innovative, why we're still talking about them, none of them really exist as the sole innovator of anything. That is, each of these three artists probably had artists that they looked up to themselves that they would probably consider more influential than even themselves. For Frank Sinatra, it was Bing Crosby. For the Beatles, it was Little Richard and Chuck Berry. For Michael Jackson, it was James Brown and Diana Ross. And even then, we could continue still to descend into every artist that influenced our favorite musicians and groups who never received a fraction of the attention that they really deserved. It's not lost on me, as a female musician myself, that there is a lack of female representation in this video. Unfortunately, the music industry was male-dominated for the longest time, and it was dominated by other factors such as race as well. So many influential artists exist out there who never got the proper credit that they should. And there are many reasons for that. In fact, I personally believe that one of our responsibilities as fans is to listen to our favorite artists when they talk about who inspired them, and to go research those artists and learn about them and figure out why they were so influential to our favorite artists. But even still considering all of this, once in every few decades, there comes an artist that seems to just get it. They seem to speak for a generation, and their music follows suit. They grasp the torch of their generation, leading the way in music and fashion and politics and ideas. These individuals are outspoken, charismatic, relatable. They bear the weight of acting as the representative of a generation and then end up aging into legends that are revered by all. They are always a bit mysterious, covered in this impenetrable cloth that seems to shroud them and keeps them one step removed from even their contemporaries who never seem to reach the same heights of stardom and success as they did. There's just something about them that carries interest and curiosity for them over into the decades, spilling out and never allowing that candle to go out. But behind them are all the artists that came before them. All those artists who our legends picked and chose portions of to replicate and to mimic. Elements that would later on become synonymous with their own brands. So who do we owe it to in the end? Our favorite entertainers, or those who came before us who we might not ever really know? Alright guys, well I really appreciate you watching. I hope that you got the chance to watch our first video on the influence of the Beatles over pop culture. I would really love it if you liked this video. If you started a conversation in the comments, who do you think is the most influential artist of all time? What are your feelings about crowning one specific artist as the most influential artist of all time? And I hope that you come back for a video next time. Thanks. Bye.